see them later.
Right.
Otherwise,
enabling system of elements that need to also contribute. So to enable these left-hand side core element strategies, we need to change the way we design things. We need to change the way we design our products, our houses, and even our business models. We need to, as we're doing in this webinar, we need to start incorporating digital technology and see how that can help us to reduce the strain we put on the planet's resources. And then, as Jane, you were saying as well, we need to start collaborating more, because thinking about our materials across the entire life cycle really requires us to know also how that entire life cycle works and what are the key steps involved and who needs to do what to really make sure that we can maximize utility and value of these resources. To give a few examples from my current location, the Netherlands, how can you use waste as a resource? Recycling is the most prominent example, I think, that is constantly used around the world, but there's some quite innovative technologies. One of them is from University of Eindhoven, spin out called Yannica, where they have found methodologies of how to recycle PET bottles and materials into food grade quality PET, recycled PET materials. Another one is the multinational company Philips, that some of you may then also know, who've adopted a lot of new business models and leasing models of how they can manage and incentivize to extend the lifetime of their products to the maximum possible level, and also incentivize that they will continuously repair and upgrade them by supplying them as a service. A similar way of rethinking the business model here is Bundles, which is an interesting service that actually offers washing machines as a service, and rather than buying your washing machine in one transaction, you pay each time you use, and therefore you're also incentivized to share them, for example, with your neighbors or a lot of parties in one big apartment building. Another example is the company Interface, who produces carpet tiles. Not only do they design them from secondary and regenerative materials, secondary in the sense that they use a lot of nylon from recycled fisher nets, but also they design them in such a way that they can afterwards be disassembled. They don't use glues or adhesives, and really be broken down into the original materials. So all of these can be reused again in creating new carpet tiles. So lots of really cool examples that are already going on. And yet, one of the key findings of our Circularity Gap report is that the circularity gap is quite large. What is the circularity gap? As I was briefly introducing before, the linear system focuses kind of on a model that builds on taking resources, making products out of those, which are ultimately used and then wasted and disposed of. And then a small portion of that is currently cycled, but there's a large gap in all those materials that end up just being disposed, ending up in landfills, being incinerated, and not used further. This is what we call the circularity gap here at Circular Economy. And that this is the number that the number of cycled materials is really what we try to give an update on a yearly basis in our Circularity Gap reporting. This number is currently 8.6%, meaning 8.6% of the materials that enter our economy every year, or at the moment, come from cycled secondary sources. 2 years ago, this was actually 9.1%. So what's quite striking about this number is that it's gone down. So we're not moving in the right direction, and that's of course very alarming. There's some reasons for it, which I'll try to explain now when we start looking a bit closer of how we can understand the way our global economy works on a material level. And if you look at this Sankey diagram, what you can see is on the left-hand side is how materials are extracted, and these can be categorized into minerals, ores, fossil fuels, and biomass resources. And also a large part of those 92 gigatons are currently being extracted from virgin sources, whereas 8.6 gigatons come from cycled resources, so secondary materials that have already had a previous life. That's how this 8.6 comes into place. So the share of these cycled materials out of the total resources entering the global economy. And what we can see in this diagram is how these materials are then used in being processed into components, into processed materials, and then ultimately being produced into the different products that satisfy our societal needs of housing, communicating with each other, being mobile, eating every day, so nutrition. Then we have also consumables, services, and healthcare. And what we can see is that a lot of it is still wasted and also added to stocks, something I'll talk about in just a minute. But of that waste, currently, of those 32.6 gigatons that are currently wasted, only 8.6 tons are really recycled. And that's, of course, not such a large share, and ultimately leads to us having this low number of 8.6%. Why has it gone down since in the past 2 years? The key reason for that is that the growth in material extraction, so what is the 92 gigatons, has by far outpaced the growth. So we actually have had some growth in the amount of recycled materials, but it's far slower than the growth of our economy, of our demand, our hunger for virgin resources. And an additional element to that is that we are still building up a lot of stock. So one thing that you can differentiate when you look at the global economy is products that flow and products that last. Products that flow are generally conceptualized as those products that will be used within that same year that they have been produced in. But actually a lot of products are also added to the global stock of machines, of housing, of buildings and infrastructure that we use every day, but that will be there for much longer than a single year. And as you can see, if we put all of that in relation, we have vast amounts of global stocks, about 890 gigatons. So one of the key challenges of a circular economy is also how can we make the best possible use of those large amount of stocks, and how can we make sure that these are then also, once they do become waste, re-entered into the economy as secondary resources. Yes, so much about the circularity gap reporting and the actual metric behind it. As you can see, we've published a few reports so far. So starting in January 2018 with the first ever Circularity Gap Report, then again in 2019, and then the last one just now in January. But also we've started reporting on this on a national level. So last year we've published a report for Austria, and are now currently working on 2 reports, one for the Netherlands and one for Norway, that will be publishing in the first half of this year. So good to watch out for those. You will all be able to find all of them in the website I have here, so circularity-gap.world. Do have a look, very interesting reports, and reach out to me if you have any questions. But let's first move on to the last part of my presentation today, which is kind of the focus we set beyond updating the circularity metric. The focus we set in this new edition of the GAP report, which is the role of countries. Why are nation states or countries so important in this transitions? The main reason is because they are the key makers of policy that will be applied on a national level, but also they're able to represent countries and inform decision-making on a global level in forums like the United Nations, and then there are meetings like the UNFCCC, but also other global collaborations across countries. So what is really what we looked at in terms of the role of countries this year is we tried to understand how circular are countries across the world already, which is something we could, with the current data, not inform on. So current data does not allow us to calculate a circularity metric for every country because simply the data on waste is not there. But we still wanted to give an indication of how well each different countries are doing. And so we looked at the goal behind all of this, which is to be in an ecologically safe and socially just space, as you were also already referring to, Jane. And we measure this by the number of planets that a country uses in terms of the biocapacity it uses up of the planet, and at the same time in terms of the quality of life, and we measure that in terms of the Human Development Index. So, and then we define this ecologically safe and socially just space as a very high level of human development, so higher than an index of 0.8, and of course a demand for biocapacity that is lower than 1 planet. And as you can see, and that's the crucial finding of this report, is no country is currently in that zone. We're all, in that sense, developing countries right now, because no one has made it into that magic area of being ecologically safe, providing a good life for its citizens, but then at the same time doing so within the limits of the planet, which is, of course, a quite striking finding, and also really turning the way we usually talk about the state of development in the world upside down, and bringing us all into the same galaxy of development. And this is something that we show in this visual in the report. It essentially shows the distance of different countries to that sweet spot of being in the ecologically safe and socially just space, whilst showcasing how much they're putting a strain on the environment, but also how high they're doing in terms of social performance. And when we look a bit closer at this, I hope we can. Seems to be a problem. Now we can look a bit closer. We can see that there's some unusual neighbors that we wouldn't normally see next to each other. So, for example, if you look to the left-hand side, we see countries like Slovenia and Ireland being right next to Bolivia or South Africa or even Congo. So when we talk about this, when we take this new perspective on how developed in that sense are countries, we actually see that everyone's developing country and we all have a lot of work to do. And there's also interesting new candidates that are doing better at reaching this goal than others, which is a curious finding. And we've dug a bit deeper into this by trying to conceptualize exactly these different kind of distances and clusters of countries of where they're at in terms of their development. And we see that this is crucially, maybe a good point to make, is how we connect all of that to the circular economy. Because of course, what we're talking here is really being ecologically safe and socially just. And the reasoning behind that is that in the pursuit of achieving a higher human development and providing for its citizens, and it's usually done through what we refer to as provisioning systems. So systems like infrastructure, systems like housing, systems like agriculture that provide people with the essential things they need and thereby ensure this high human development. And these different systems can, of course, have a very different environmental and material footprint. So there are very different means to building a house and providing housing. There are very different means to providing mobility to people, and these can come at very different material footprints. And that's where we see the circular economy coming into the debate in really lowering the environmental and material footprint of delivering higher social development. And what I was just referring to is there's three clusters that we formed based on this analysis of countries where we see these all have a similar kind of distance to go, or a similar route to take, even though they might have similar distances to that ecological and social sweet spot, but they have a similar direction that they need to be taking. So on the one hand, we have built countries who are generally characterized by not being able to deliver in terms of social development, human development. We have growth countries who've been growing heavily, but also more and more at an environmental cost, and therefore, to some extent, deliver higher social development, but also do so at a high cost to the environment. And then lastly, we have shift countries that enable very high human development, but really at extraordinarily high rates of consumption and environmental impact. I'll very quickly go through some of the kind of transition pathways that we foresee for each of these countries before we can then enter into discussion, because I'm of course also very curious to hear your thoughts on how countries can play a role in this. So first of all, in terms of build countries, what's very crucial for these is that they're building up a lot of stock, and they're still building up a lot of these provisioning systems that I was just talking about. So they need to make sure that they design the circular economy into these, that they're designed to be reused, to be recycled in the end, and to last as long as possible. They're currently largely operated, up to 95% actually, by the informal economy. In a circular economy, they need to make sure that this distributed network of workers can actually be leveraged to achieve the highest possible effectiveness in lowering material footprint and environmental footprint. And lastly, these countries are heavily reliant on their current farming and agricultural sectors, which can also be turned into a strength in being the source of a powerful bioeconomy going forward. In grow countries, we have some similar challenges, but also new ones, because these countries are starting to build up a growing middle class, so they need to really think about the way they are consuming and they need to think about smart consumption models, such as sharing models, as I was talking about earlier. They still need to build up a lot of stock. They need to deliver a lot of social development to a lot of people still, so they also need to build up these systems. So again, there's this idea of building circularity into these stocks. They also have a large share of informal workers, but they also have starting to build up a formalized workforce, especially when it comes to waste management. They have formalized processes, but they also have these large informal processes. So it will be quite crucial to align those and transform both of those into one single system that is as effective as possible in retrieving secondary materials again. And then lastly, these countries have a hunger for growth, for growing their industrial activity, which of course needs to be powered by renewable energy going forward, and not so much be growing the fossil energy sources. And then lastly, we have countries like shift countries, which I think all of us are currently situated in, not necessarily speaking to the online community, because I'm not sure from where they're joining, but here in Amsterdam, we certainly are in our bubble, and I think the same goes for the United States, where we really have a big task ahead of us in shifting to different and smarter ways of consumption, where we drastically lower the resource intensity of our consumption, of our provisioning systems in terms of mobility, in terms of housing, but really our consumption of textiles. And what's quite important is we are the master traders of the world. We tend to outsource a lot of the impacts of our economy. We source our products and our components from elsewhere, and then we also export what we produce elsewhere. So we don't really take control of the impacts that we currently have. And then lastly, we are the ones who, or shift countries are the ones who have been for the longest time building up their capacities for energy from fossil sources. So they have the biggest task ahead of themselves now in driving the renewable transition and ramping that up. This was already about it from my side. I'm very excited to hear your questions now, and whatever we can already clarify now. I'm very excited to answer those questions now, but also feel free to reach out to me. I put my email address in there, but also comment on the webinar posts on our social media on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. But yeah, thanks so much for listening, and then giving back the word to you, Jane, to see if we can answer some questions already.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Caspar. And if I can encourage those who are online, I see we have one question already online, which I'll come to just now, but just for our colleagues in the room and all of you online, we have people online from Arkansas, Amsterdam, Belgium, Brazil, Russia, I think someone from Mexico. So please do type your questions in. But I'd like to start. I've certainly got a number of questions, but I'd like to actually open it up to the room to start with, and see if we've got questions from the room, and then I will come back and also go online. But if I can, lady at the back, and then if you can introduce yourself and.
Oh, sure. Hi, my name is Diane Williams. I'm a computer scientist, an edtech entrepreneur and alumna of MIT, Sloan, and Harvard. I was thinking about, especially while I was first thinking insularly about the U.S. in terms of shifting the whole model for the economics and wonder the contributing factors to why the number went down. I remember a lot of the fix-it clinics for appliances and electronics, which are filling the landfills by leaps and bounds. And the fix-it community has to fight to get the companies to build products that can be fixed. The economic model is, when I saw the word stock, the first thing I thought was Wall Street. I wasn't thinking about stock because I think about the whole economic model is driven by short-term thinking, by 10K, 10Q, quarterly reporting. What incentive do companies have? I won't mention anybody, but you know what they are. The technical companies have for creating products that can in fact be reused, recycled, regenerated, rather than just a niche market.
Absolutely. I think that's a sufficiently meaty and in-depth question. Let's just stick with that question now. Caspar, do you want to give your thoughts on that both? And it seems to me there's sort of two design questions here we're talking about. One is actually the sort of financial incentive economic system design question, which is a massive one, but are there interesting examples that you're seeing, whether it's stock exchanges, major investors beginning to look at this issue and push for it? But then secondly, the sort of the technical design question, and in each of the countries you're talking about sort of new technical solutions, and how do we start incentivizing some of those technologies which will design circularity into stock and into products?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, and really an interesting one, and the problem you're describing is quite an accurate one, that short-term thinking is indeed the dominant kind of paradigm, determining investments, where they go, and also how companies based on that plan their own technological kind of transformation and their strategies. So what we at Circular Economy find really important is to also highlight how looking a bit further into the future might help quite a lot. And there's kind of two key components to that. One caters a bit to the risks that you're running in the long term by continuing the way you are. And then on the other hand, also there's the element of kind of looking at what other sources of value that are maybe a bit more long term can actually such a new model of using your resources can bring. And to start with the first one, what we can already see, and one of them is what I touched upon with the finite nature of a lot of our resources, that locking in dependencies and scarcities and seeing more and more geopolitical tensions also in respect to some of the resources are something that is very relevant to companies, maybe not in this quarter and maybe not in the next one, but they more and more start thinking about these things in the long term. And then also it's no longer just the stakeholders, stockholders pushing for that those quarterly results, but we really see also an uprise in consumers, in other stakeholder groups that are pushing for a transformation, which doesn't necessarily pass most companies untouched. And then on the other hand, in terms of the drivers from a value perspective in the long term, what we see more and more, and what in terms of the feedback we also get from our clients and the companies that we work with, is that the circular economy can indeed be a source of value more in the long term, but in very diverse ways. So it can generate access to new markets that you haven't necessarily thought about before, because it's a target group that uses a product differently and therefore wasn't as interesting to you before, but actually it's a target group that is quite receptive to a circular product. You can reduce costs because you effectively use a lot less materials, and try to also kind of reduce the complexity of a lot of your products. You can even be much more attractive, and that's actually quite a driving force, or becoming more and more a driving force. You can be very attractive on the labor market. You can retain and you can attract top talent, because that's what top talent is looking for companies that have a vision for the future that goes beyond the short-term profits. And then it's also about the business models we were talking about, that allow for much closer relationship with your clients. So these service models that have a much higher long-term value with your clients. And all of these things are maybe not the things that are immediately convincing companies to go into new short-term investments, but in the long term, we do see more and more of a shift in investments. And that's maybe to some extent also relating to the second question, really, of how to finance the technical solution. So one of the things is what we do see major investment funds. I think BlackRock recently announced that they're going to start divesting from fossil fuel related stocks. But then also we really see the role of governments in pushing for these technical solutions that we need. And especially in the countries that are still developing at a rapid pace, we see that the public procurement and governmental procurement plays a huge role in kind of pushing for higher standards on environmental environmental standards, but also circular economy related standards, which will be quite crucial in implementing these new circular systems in these countries. So yeah, I think that kind of would be my answer to your question. I hope that sort of answers it.
Yeah, and I think you have two very important points there, given our focus of this study group on the role of governments, that procurement role of government, I think we often don't think strategically enough about. And then secondly, you're sort of starting to go there. I think one of the things that is really changing sort of the investor framing of it, and therefore the corporate side, is new types of accounting and sort of multiple capital accounting systems. And I think if governments can set up disclosure requirements that companies and financial investors have to report on not just financial capital, but other types of capital, that will also, sort of start pushing and shifting the incentives a bit. So I think, we talk normally about sort of command and control rules and regulations, but governments, with disclosure requirements around accounting frameworks and procurement can be a key value. What I'm going to do is take one of the questions from online, which is from Marcus Teixeira. Marcus, I'm not sure where you're sitting, but he's just saying nowadays we have many challenges in multilateral forums to take decisions and act. How do we expect to move forward with the circular economy given the multilateral challenges? And I think, Kat, that's one of the questions I had. It's great knowing what countries are doing at the individual level, but from both a multilateral negotiation perspective and also the wealthier companies providing resources and technology transfer to some of the build and grow countries, so that they can make some of the shift. Where do you see the potential on that front?
So in terms of overcoming these challenges that we're facing in building the necessary ambition in these multilateral kind of commitments, is that the question? Yeah,
at the multilateral level, etc. And then how can your countries, the wealthier countries, provide resources to particularly the build countries, which do have more of a platform to start a more circular design process on?
Yeah, I think the key part is, and that's what's happening in these multilateral kind of entities such as the UNFCCC, to give all of these countries more of a voice and make sure that they are heard. But then on the other hand, I think in the countries that need to do kind of the major heavy lifting in making this shift, what we see more and more is also that what really accelerates the moving forward is the public and the general public in stepping up and taking to the streets, even as we're seeing now more and more in the climate movement, in building that momentum, but then also having similar voices heard from the business community, with companies also speaking up and saying, we actually want a change in system, but that requires certain policies that also allow us to do so and incentivize that. So in that sense, I think it's for all the involved parties to really speak up and put pressure such that the political will is there, and also the political backing. And of course, then I'm talking about some share of companies and individuals, but we need to, of course, grow that group and make sure that everyone kind of boards that ship and can get convinced by that. So it's a lot of bringing facts to the discussion and informing people, and thereby getting them on board. So that's also something that we try to do in the Circularity Gap Reporting initiative to really raise awareness. And on the circular economy topic, I think that we're a bit less far ahead as we are, for example, in the whole climate change debate, where already 20 years ago the UNFCCC was founded, and a lot of this multilateral exchange and interaction has already been happening. With the circular economy, this is only just starting to form, with this topic becoming more and more relevant at forums like the World Economic Forum in Davos. But this process of formalization is only just starting to happen on this topic.
Great, thank you. So basically we need more coalitions of business leaders like we've had in climate, as well as the civic action. Thank you. Yep. I'd like to now turn to someone in the audience. And why don't we take two from our participants here? So Graham and then another colleague at the back. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Caspar, for your presentation. My name is Graham Sinclair, and ESG Architect. I'm currently co-teaching a study group on investing in the Arctic. My reflection to you from a US point of view, the most famous investment shop active in the circular economy in the US is Closed Loop Partners, who just 4 months ago announced a $100 million deal with a bunch of American Beverage Association companies, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Keurig, to work on a heavy bottle back, basically improving the bottle recycling infrastructure. And I'm curious to understand your presentation today about the role of governments. And in many of these aspects, as Jane will well know from her many years of experience moving the field forward, we're in a season now, I would argue, where companies are ahead of governments. And a government-led approach is perhaps not as useful or powerful, perhaps, as one would have thought 20 years ago. So I'd appreciate how you'd reflect on, you've demonstrated you've got the Norway report coming and maybe the Netherlands report, but have you thought about applying these reports at a sector or industry level, where you can use then the powerful strategy of leveraging those incumbent interests in that vertical, who inevitably will be part of the implementation or execution of whatever your recommendations are? Thank you.
Okay, so sort of industry sector level reports. And let's take one more question as we, as always, start running out of time, and then I'll come back to you, Caspar.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Kate. I work for the City of Boston as a fellow through Harvard. Something that I think that cities are thinking about in terms of procurement to that piece is sequencing. And so when you have to be really fiscally responsible with taxpayer money, at what point do you wait for these solutions to come to scale and be cheaper and more implementable, or at what point do you kind of change your procurement patterns? So like, let's say we want to roll out like a massive increase number of blue bikes we're having. Do we wait until there's blue bikes or electrical batteries that have longer lifespans, but then are we kind of waiting for the business development to a point that's detrimental, or should we be leading? We don't want to lead too soon and then procure something when like maybe 10 years from now there's a cheaper or longer lasting solution. So I'm just trying to think about sequencing and timing and how all these pieces from similarly, do you wait for a national plan so things can be more comprehensive and streamlined and probably more efficient, or do you kind of do it piecemeal because the times are calling for it? So kind of curious to how you think about timeline sequencing and the roles that cities play, as well as we talk about government writ large.
Great, fantastic. And one of our online questions is also very specifically on the role of cities. So, Caspar, maybe you can start with that and then come back to the industry sector one, the role of cities, and then particularly sort of sequencing and decision making at the city level, and then we'll come to the industry sector question.
Sure. Do you want to mention the other question on cities, or should I first start with this one?
The other question was, what do you see for the role of cities? So I think, yeah. So more, yeah. Any thoughts on the role of cities, and where would be a good place for municipalities to begin thinking about this? And then the more specific question on sequencing.
Yeah. I think the role of cities is quite an interesting one, and while we have maybe picked national governments as the key driving force of making decisions on a national and a multilateral level, I think cities are extremely interesting and important in doing the on-the-ground kind of work, and therefore really doing kind of the feasibility checks of what really works, and as you were saying, what really works also at what timeline. And in that sense, they're the ones also piloting a lot of these initiatives that then other cities can learn from, and they're of course in that sense able to move much faster. In terms of sequencing, I think you're raising a really important point, because of course you never know, is that certain technology really ready for such a rollout on a level that justifies public procurement of such. And I think we have seen a bit of a failure in this on the Chinese market, where actually the example of bikes that you were making, bike sharing services were booming for a while, and then all of a sudden that kind of blew out of proportion, and actually they're now having these huge bicycle cemeteries of used bikes that are no longer used, and where these resources then end up actually wasted. And so we need to be quite cautious in terms of these booms and these hypes that we're causing. So in that sense, I do think it's a gradual process where we need to start piloting. And as I was saying, that's really where I see an important role of cities kind of driving this forward and doing these pilot projects, especially with local partners, and then seeing which solutions also fit which local context. But then as indeed being cautious of kind of massive national rollouts of solutions, but really having that first be informed by smaller size pilot projects on a city level.
And are there particular examples you're aware of, just sticking with cities for now, of sort of shared learning between cities? I know there's the 100 resilient cities and the C40. Are you sort of seeing interesting examples, of city learning around specific aspects of the circular economy?
Well, I do think there's one great learning, and that's kind of the one that you were referencing already, in terms of working together and connecting cities across the globe, and then also forming a network of cities collaborating with each other on finding these solutions. So you were just referencing the C40 network. More specific examples, I mean, you can keep talking about the bike examples, or here in Holland, we also stick a lot to the bicycles, and then even also the pavement that those bikes go on, which are more and more now produced with completely recycled secondary kind of asphalt solutions. In terms of, so this would be also a solution that they piloted here. I'd actually like to kind of also think a bit more on this question, because it's something that I personally don't work on, but we have a team at Circular Economy working exclusively with cities and on cities, and they have a lot of very exciting projects with specific cities where they have learned a lot about these about these examples. But one thing that I would like to share, for example, is the efforts that Amsterdam does as a city, also in terms of bringing together stakeholders in kind of co-developing this circular sustainable future. And what Circular Economy has been part of is applying the concept of the donut, the donut economics by Kate Raworth, which essentially uses the concept of planetary boundaries on the one hand, so really kind of us overshooting several dimensions of environmental indicators, and on the other hand, building a social foundation using similar indicators as we did also with the Human Development Index, and kind of having dedicated co-creation, co-development sessions with different stakeholders in the cities, from really the normal citizen to government officials to also private sector participants, to form this vision together. And I think that this collaborative process is a crucial example to kind of put forward, and also what can inform making the right decisions that will also be picked up locally. So in terms of piloting new projects.
Okay, no, thanks for that, and we'll make sure Boston and Amsterdam get in touch, and put Kate in touch with your colleagues who are working on cities. And then we can get to the industry sector case, and then got sort of one more question online. I'll check if there are any more questions here, and then we'll start wrapping up.
Yeah, On the industry, should I quickly answer on the industry sector reports already?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. Indeed, I find the idea of industry level reports very interesting, and that's really where you start understanding how to apply the circular economy in a certain context, in the context of a certain type of materials that you will be using, a certain type of product with, of course, a certain with a specific life cycle to it. What we do realize is that industries then on a level that are too high, have a too high level of aggregation, are then quite difficult to kind of generalize on. And I mean, that's a similar problem that we ran into with governments here. But one of the reasons we haven't really dug that deep into industry level reports is that we find it quite hard to find the right level of analysis there, because you really want to then start looking into individual product groups that have kind of a shared life cycle that you can dig deeper into, and then per each stage of the life cycle can give more concrete kind of recommendations. But then on the other hand, to be honest, there's somewhat of an momentum component to this, that we also received a lot of questions after the previous gap reports that were on what does this mean for my country? How circular is my country? How can we measure the progress of our country? And then with a very diverse group of stakeholders. So it's also a matter of trying to reach a larger and broader group of stakeholders in a certain country with this report.
Great. Well, thank you on that. It does seem an area where I guess the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and some of the other business networks could be doing more work on the business side. I'm conscious sorry, Caspar, carry on.
No, I was just confirming what you were saying.
Okay, great, good. Do we have any more questions in the room here? And if not, I've got one final question online, which is more or less sort of is a bookend to Beverly's earlier question. The one argument that some people have against circular economies is that financial growth is not as steep as it is in linear economies. The current system is built under the idea of the more we buy, the more money is moved around, therefore the more financial benefit. My question is, in a system that has unfortunately been built and continues to move towards extreme consumerism, how do we reconcile circular economies and the idea of buy, buy, buy? And we sort of looked partly at the sort of financial system and lack of incentives in the financial system. Caspar, do you want to sort of say more about consumers in particular and consumer behavior, and what else we might need to sort of shift in terms of the us being the responsible buy. We had an article in the New York Times recently about cheap clothes are never cheap if you look at the full costs that go into them, both environmental and social. So could you give us some insight on that as we wrap up? Yeah,
and I do indeed see the argument of much slower growth and steep financial curves, and much less steep financial curves under this circular economy as we're transitioning through it. And I think that's the key point to make here, that this is a really, really big change, a really big systemic change that requires a long transition. And I think that the true benefits and kind of the reinforcing system dynamics that will then start to create a lot more value and a lot steeper growth curves also only happen once we really start putting the right infrastructure in place and the right business model incentivization in place. Because if you think about it, in a circular economy, you effectively have so many more transactions between businesses, between consumers, because you effectively add a whole another level to the supply chain, which is all about the different reverse activities of repairing, refurbishing, upgrading. So it's a matter of rethinking these business models and how to also price this value, this additional value. And of course, that takes some incentivization also from the policy side. But if you think about just simply the number of transactions and also the amount of work it takes and the amount of jobs that are associated with, for example, you were mentioning the example of textiles. If you just produce textiles and waste them, that's far less jobs than as compared to when you also repair them or when you also recycle them. So of course that requires us to move to a different type of products also in the first place that enable us to be willing to pay more for that also. So they offer higher quality, they offer more durability, more also kind of an opportunity for emotional attachment. But overall, I think that the point that's really important to make here is that once the system is there, the sheer number of transactions in a circular economy will also be a vast source of growth.
Great. No, well, thank you. And I think that's probably a good note to end on from your side, that, sort of, you're not only sort of fundamentally thinking that the system or accounting mechanisms, but, where are the growth opportunities? And it's, I think so much of this can be framed, both the risk of not making the transition we need to make, but the opportunities environmentally, socially, as well as economically, if we can get it right. And I think, sort of in closing from my side, it sort of seems so clear to me, we know we need to make this transition. We actually know what the pathways are, and I think the circularity gap sort of framing of the build countries, the grow countries, the shift countries, and then how that sort of filters down to cities and to industry sectors is a very useful framing. And it's absolutely clear, and this conversation reinforces what I think many of us know, is that what's lacking is the right incentive mechanisms and incentive structures, and actually sort of thinking through, particularly given our focus on the role of governments, what's the regulatory framework, but what is the procurement framework, what are the disclosure requirements of business, what are the disclosure requirements of financial institutions in beginning to shift this agenda forward. And then finally, this opportunity for these coalitions, like the C40, the 100 Resilient Cities, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the PACE initiative, specifically around the circular economy. And I think the more we can have those coalitions, the more likely we are to move forward. So, and the coalitions and pathways sort of supported by evidence-based sort of analysis, which I think, Caspar, you and your colleagues have really done here. So we will make sure that everyone has, sort of access to the report. I think everyone knows where to find it. And we'd just like to take the opportunity, first of all, to thank everyone in the room with us today, to thank all of you from literally around the world. A relatively small in number, but very, very broad and geographic spread. And a very strong thank you, Caspar, to you, both for being with us, but also the incredibly important work you're doing, and today, and our student organizers.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We'll continue this conversation tomorrow. So it's a whole day circular economy symposium event at Harvard. So there are virtual tickets available. Physical in-person tickets are sold out, but we still have virtual tickets. So if you haven't gotten that already, please tune in. We have so many experts across 4 different panels taking, really difficult, challenging questions on the circular economy. So, join us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. And thanks again, Caspar.
And Jane.
Thanks, Caspar.